There is a tank sitting in a garage somewhere in the American desert that will drink your car's entire fuel tank in about 12 minutes of idle. Not driving, not in combat, just sitting there, engine running, waiting. The M1 Abrams is the most lethal main battle tank ever built, and it runs on jet fuel, the same stuff that powers commercial airliners. And that single engineering decision has haunted the United States military for over 4 decades, created some of the most spectacular logistical nightmares in modern warfare, and at the same time given American armor a battlefield advantage so decisive that enemies have learned there is simply no good time to be in front of one. This is the story of the AGT-1500, the turbine heart of the Abrams, and why the Army chose to build the most fuel-hungry ground vehicle in military history on purpose. To understand why this engine exists, you need to understand what the Army was trying to solve in the early 1970s. The Cold War was no longer an abstract threat. Soviet armor had modernized dramatically. The T-64 and T-72 were rolling off production lines by the thousands, and NATO war planners running simulations of a Soviet push through the Fulda Gap into West Germany were getting numbers that kept generals awake at night. The math was brutal. Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces had a massive numerical advantage in tanks. If war broke out in Europe, American armor would not win by having more tanks. It would have to win by having better ones. Faster, more lethal, more survivable. The problem was that the existing American tank, the M60, was not going to cut it against the new generation of Soviet armor in a straight fight across the German plains. So the Army launched the program that would eventually become the Abrams, and the question of what engine to put inside it became one of the most contested engineering debates in American military history. The conventional answer was a diesel engine. Diesel was what every other serious military in the world was using in their tanks. It was proven, reliable, relatively fuel-efficient, and logistically simple because it ran on the same fuel as most other military vehicles. The German Leopard 2, which was being developed at roughly the same time, used a diesel. The Soviet T-72 used a diesel. Even earlier, American tanks had used diesel or gasoline piston engines. The argument for diesel was straightforward. It worked, it was understood, and the supply chain already existed. But the Army chose something else entirely, and the company that won the contract was Avco Lycoming, with a power plant that had never been seriously used in a ground combat vehicle before. The AGT-1500. A gas turbine engine. The AGT-1500 is not an engine that makes sense until you understand what it actually does. It is essentially a jet engine adapted for ground use. Instead of the thrust being expelled out the back to propel an aircraft, the rotational energy is transferred through a sophisticated transmission system to drive the tank's tracks. The turbine spins at extraordinarily high RPM internally, and through a series of mechanical reductions, that energy becomes the torque needed to move 68 tons of steel, composite armor, and ammunition across any terrain you point it at. The engine produces 1,500 horsepower. For comparison, a modern diesel semi-truck engine produces somewhere between 400 and 600 horsepower. The Abrams has more than double that, in a vehicle designed to fight, not haul freight. What that power translates to on the battlefield is something that still surprises people who see it for the first time. The M1 Abrams can accelerate from 0 to 20 miles per hour in roughly 7 seconds. A vehicle that weighs more than most suburban houses can move with an urgency that feels physically wrong when you watch it. Its governed top speed on roads is officially around 42 miles per hour, though the true mechanical limit is higher and the governor exists mostly to protect the drivetrain. Cross-country, over broken terrain, ditches and obstacles that would force a wheeled vehicle to stop entirely, the Abrams maintains speeds that simply have no business being possible for something its size. And this is where the turbine engine earns its place because a diesel engine of equivalent power output in the 1970s would have been physically larger, heavier, and would have taken significantly longer to reach full power output from a cold or low power state. The AGT-1500 has what engineers call excellent power-to-weight ratio and near-instant throttle response. When the driver pushes the throttle, the power arrives almost immediately. There is no diesel lag, no turbo spool-up delay, no mechanical hesitation. In a combat situation where a tank crew needs to accelerate out of an ambush, cross a fire line, or reposition before a second missile arrives, those seconds of delay are not abstract. They are the difference between being somewhere else when the round hits and not being somewhere else. The turbine gave the Abrams a responsiveness that its designers considered worth every logistical complication that came with it, and the complications were serious. The fuel consumption of the AGT-1500 under combat load is, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. The Abrams burns approximately 10 gallons of fuel per mile in cross-country combat operations. Some operational reports from the Gulf War and Iraq put the figure even higher depending on terrain and operational tempo. The tank carries roughly 500 gallons of fuel internally. Do that math and you arrive at a vehicle with a combat range of somewhere between 200 and 300 miles under ideal conditions, and considerably less when things get complicated. For a military that already had an enormous logistical apparatus built around moving fuel to the front lines, the Abrams added a new level of complexity that planners had to account for every single time the tank was deployed. The fuel itself was the other problem. The AGT-1500 is designed to run on JP-8, the standard military jet fuel. It can technically burn diesel, heating oil, and several other fuels in an emergency, which is one of the design advantages the Army pointed to when justifying the turbine. The multi-fuel capability is real, but in practice, JP-8 is what it runs on, and JP-8 is what the Air Force also runs on, meaning that every gallon of fuel the Army burns in an Abrams is a gallon that exists in the same supply chain as fighter jets, helicopters, and transport aircraft. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions executed one of the fastest armored advances in military history across the Iraqi desert, covering distances that stunned military observers worldwide. The performance was remarkable. The fuel consumption was also remarkable. American fuel trucks were working around the clock to keep pace with the armor, and there were moments during the advance when the question was not whether the Iraqis could stop the Abrams, but whether American fuel convoys could keep up with their own tanks. They did, barely, largely because the operational tempo was high enough that the campaign ended before the logistics became a catastrophic constraint. Iraq in 2003 presented similar dynamics but in a different context. Urban combat is particularly savage on turbine fuel consumption because the engine continues burning fuel even when the tank is stationary and on alert. A tank holding a position in a city street, engine running, ready to move at any moment, is consuming fuel at a rate that has nothing to do with actually going anywhere. Diesel engines are more economical at idle and low-power states. The turbine is not. This fundamental inefficiency of the gas turbine at anything below high-power output has been a continuous criticism of the Abrams engine choice since before the tank even entered service, and it has never been fully resolved. The Army has studied replacement power plants and alternative engine configurations multiple times over the decades, and the AGT-1500 or its updated variants have remained in the tank every single time, not because the logistical problems were solved, but because no replacement has convincingly offered equivalent power delivery and reliability within the weight and volume constraints of the Abrams hull. There is one more characteristic of the AGT-1500 that rarely gets the attention it deserves in discussions about the Abrams, and it is perhaps the most tactically interesting aspect of the entire engine choice. Gas turbine engines are significantly quieter than diesel piston engines at operational RPM. This sounds counterintuitive until you understand the acoustic signature. A diesel tank produces a rhythmic, mechanical sound that carries for considerable distances, particularly at night or in conditions of limited visibility when sound becomes a primary sensor for infantry. The turbine produces a smoother, higher-frequency sound that many veterans and military observers describe as a whoosh rather than a rumble. It disperses differently in terrain. It is harder to localize by ear, and in certain operational conditions, particularly when the Abrams is moving across open ground at speed, the turbine signature has been described by enemy combatants and in after-action reports as arriving with far less warning than a diesel-powered vehicle of equivalent size. This acoustic advantage is not decisive on its own, but in the context of a vehicle that is already faster and more responsive than anything it is likely to encounter, the fact that it also provides less acoustic warning to infantry in its path is a genuine tactical consideration. The thermal signature is a different story. Gas turbines run extremely hot, and the Abrams exhaust system vents heat in ways that create a significant infrared signature detectable by thermal imaging equipment. Considerable engineering has gone into managing the exhaust temperature and direction to mitigate this, but it remains a known characteristic of the platform. Every major capability involves trade-offs, and the turbine is no different. The heat signature and the fuel consumption are the costs. The power, the speed, the responsiveness, and the acoustic profile are the returns. Whether the exchange makes sense depends entirely on the threat environment and the operational scenario, which is partly why this debate has never produced a clean answer. What is not debated is what the Abrams accomplished with this engine in every major engagement it has participated in. During Desert Storm, not a single Abrams was destroyed by enemy fire. In the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003, Abrams' losses to enemy direct fire were minimal, and the ones that were disabled were almost universally recovered, repaired, and returned to service. The tank's combination of firepower, armor, and mobility has produced a battlefield record that is genuinely without parallel in the history of modern armored warfare. Whether you attribute that primarily to crew training, to the Chobham and depleted uranium composite armor, to the 120mm main gun, or to the AGT 1500 and the mobility it provides, the answer is probably that you cannot separate them. The engine made the tank what it is. Everything else was built around what that engine made possible.